The most dangerous thing about Light Yagami is not what he did, but how certain he was that he was right. There is a quiet kind of pressure that does not scream, does not leave visible scars, but settles deep inside a person like a weight they learn to carry without question. Light Yagami grew up in a world where excellence was not just expected, it was the baseline, where being good was invisible, and only perfection was worthy of attention. And somewhere along the way, a subtle belief took root, almost unnoticed, almost harmless at first. If you are not the best, you are nothing. This is the kind of wound that doesn't look like trauma from the outside. No broken home, no obvious neglect, just a life that seems perfectly put together, but inside, it builds a fragile identity, one that depends entirely on being above everyone else. Because when your value is measured by comparison, every other person becomes a silent threat. Every mistake becomes a crack in who you think you are. So Light doesn't just strive to succeed. He needs to dominate, to prove, to confirm again and again that he is different, that he is superior, that he is untouchable. And here is where something shifts, something subtle but irreversible. Because superiority is no longer just a trait, it becomes a shield, a defense mechanism protecting him from a deeper fear he cannot afford to face, the fear of being ordinary. And when that belief hardens, it begins to reshape the way he sees the world. People are no longer equals. They become variables, outcomes, pieces in a system that only he feels capable of understanding. Not because he is cruel, not because he lacks intelligence, but because his entire identity depends on maintaining that distance, that elevation above everyone else. This is how moral lines start to blur, not through chaos, but through logic, through justification, through a quiet internal narrative that says, if I am right, then what I do must also be right. And the terrifying part is, it doesn't feel like corruption. It feels like clarity, like purpose, like finally stepping into the role you were always meant to play. But what if that clarity is just another illusion, a carefully constructed story designed to protect a fragile sense of self? Because when you believe you are above everyone else, you stop questioning yourself, and the moment self-doubt disappears, so does the last barrier between control and collapse. And maybe that is what makes Light's story so unsettling, not because it is distant or extreme, but because it echoes something uncomfortably familiar, a quiet voice many of us have heard at least once, whispering that being better is the only way to matter, that being average is something to escape at all costs. So the real question is not whether someone like Light could exist in the world, but whether that same belief, in a smaller, quieter form, already exists within us, waiting for the right moment to grow. There is a moment when control stops being a skill and quietly turns into an obsession, not loud, not obvious, but precise, calculated, almost invisible even to the person experiencing it. For someone like Light, control is not about power in the traditional sense. It is about safety, about ensuring that nothing unpredictable can ever threaten the identity he has spent his entire life building. Because when your sense of self is fragile beneath the surface, you do not look for connection, you look for certainty, and certainty requires control. This is where a different layer of his psychology begins to unfold, one that is less about superiority and more about an inability to tolerate uncertainty, an intolerance so deep that it reshapes the way he interacts with reality itself. The world, in its natural state, is chaotic, inconsistent, filled with people who make irrational choices, and for most, that chaos is simply part of being human, but for Light, it is unacceptable. It feels like disorder, like imperfection, like something that must be corrected. And so, instead of adapting to the world, he begins to redesign it in his mind, reducing complexity into systems, into rules, into outcomes that can be predicted and controlled. This is not cruelty. This is cognitive restructuring, a defense mechanism where ambiguity is eliminated to protect the self from anxiety. Because if everything can be calculated, then nothing can surprise him. And if nothing can surprise him, then nothing can make him feel small, powerless, or insignificant. But control, when taken to this level, comes with a cost that is rarely acknowledged at first. It slowly erodes the ability to see others as independent, emotional beings. People stop being people, they become patterns, behaviors, probabilities, and once that shift happens, Empathy does not disappear all at once. It fades gradually, replaced by efficiency, by logic, by outcomes that feel justified because they are internally consistent. This creates a dangerous inner environment where every decision feels rational, where every action can be explained, defended, and reinforced by the same system that produced it. And the more this system proves itself effective, the stronger it becomes, locking him into a feedback loop where control validates itself. But beneath all of this precision, there is something much more fragile, something almost childlike in its origin, a fear of losing control, a fear of being at the mercy of forces he cannot predict or influence. And that fear does not disappear when control increases. It grows quieter, more hidden, but also more powerful, because now it is protected by a structure that cannot easily be questioned. This is why letting go becomes impossible, because letting go would mean confronting the uncertainty he has spent his entire life trying to escape. It would mean accepting that the world cannot be perfected, that people cannot be reduced to systems, that he himself is not immune to randomness, to failure, to being wrong. And so he continues, not just because he wants to, but because he no longer knows how to stop, because control has stopped being a choice and has become the only way he knows how to exist. And maybe that is the quiet tragedy hidden beneath it all, not that he seeks control, but that without it, he does not know who he is. There is a quiet fracture that forms when a person begins to live between two identities, not fully one, not fully the other, but constantly shifting, constantly negotiating which version of themselves deserves to exist. For light, this fracture does not appear as confusion. It appears as certainty, as control, as an unwavering sense of direction. But beneath that surface, there is a tension that never truly resolves. On one side, there is the version of him that still understands human limits, the part that was raised to believe in structure, in justice, in a world where right and wrong are not determined by one individual. This part does not disappear. It lingers, quieter over time, but still present, still aware. On the other side, there is a growing identity that no longer sees itself as bound by those same rules, an identity that believes it has outgrown the limitations of ordinary thinking, that it has the clarity others lack. And this is where the inner conflict begins to deepen, because these two versions cannot coexist peacefully. One demands humility, the other demands dominance. One recognizes uncertainty, the other rejects it entirely. And instead of resolving this tension, Light does something far more psychologically complex. He begins to rewrite the narrative in a way that allows both to exist, but only on his terms. This is where unmet needs begin to reveal themselves, not in obvious ways, but in the structure of his thinking. At the core, there is a need that has never been fully satisfied, the need to be seen, not just as capable, but as essential, as someone whose existence changes the world in a meaningful way. It is not enough to succeed. It is not enough to be respected. He needs to matter on a scale that validates every expectation that has ever been placed on him. And when that need is not fulfilled through normal means, it does not disappear, it intensifies. It searches for new pathways, new justifications, new roles that can finally satisfy it. This is why the idea of becoming something greater, something beyond ordinary human limitation, becomes so psychologically appealing, because it offers a solution to a problem he has never been able to articulate. But here lies the contradiction. The more he steps into this elevated identity, the more he distances himself from the very things that could have fulfilled that need in a healthier way: connection, vulnerability, being understood without having to prove anything. And so, the need remains unmet, even as he moves further away from the person he once was. This creates a loop of internal tension, where every step forward feels like progress, but also deepens the gap between who he is and what he actually needs. Because what he truly seeks is not control, not superiority, but recognition that does not have to be earned through constant performance. Yet that kind of recognition requires something he cannot allow himself to do. It requires letting go of the identity he has built, the identity that protects him from ever feeling insignificant. So instead, he chooses the version of himself that feels stronger, more certain, more complete, even if it comes at the cost of silencing the part of him that still questions, still hesitates, still remembers what it means to simply be human. And over time, that quieter voice does not disappear. It just becomes harder to hear, buried beneath layers of logic, justification, and the constant need to prove that he was right all along. And maybe that is the deepest conflict of all, not between good and evil, but between the need to be human and the fear that being human is not enough. There is always a moment when a belief stops being a thought and becomes a decision, not loud, not dramatic, but quiet, almost ordinary, like something that could have gone unnoticed if not for what follows. For Light, that moment does not begin with action, it begins with interpretation, with the way he chooses to understand what has been placed in front of him. Because the true turning point is not the object itself, it is the meaning he assigns to it, the story he immediately begins to tell himself about what it represents. To someone else, it could have been dismissed, questioned, even feared, but for him, it becomes something else entirely. It becomes validation. Validation that the world is as flawed as he always believed it to be. Validation that his dissatisfaction was justified. Validation that he was never wrong for thinking that things needed to change. And in that instant, something inside him aligns for the first time. His intelligence, his frustration, his need for control, all of it suddenly points in the same direction. This is the psychological trigger, not the discovery itself, but the realization that he now has the means to act on a belief he has carried quietly for years. And what makes this moment so powerful is how quickly it feels natural, how easily it integrates into his existing worldview, as if this was never a disruption, but the next logical step. There is no hesitation in the way most people would expect, because hesitation requires doubt, and doubt requires a willingness to question oneself, something he has spent his entire life minimizing. Instead, what appears is a form of cognitive clarity, a narrowing of possibilities where only one path feels correct, not because it is objectively right, but because it is internally consistent with everything he already believes. This is where the first real shift occurs, not in behavior, but in identity. He is no longer just someone observing the world. He becomes someone who believes he is responsible for shaping it. And that belief changes everything, because responsibility, when tied to superiority, transforms into authority, and authority, when unchecked, begins to rewrite moral boundaries. The mind does something remarkable here. It protects itself by reframing the situation, turning what could be seen as a moral dilemma into a problem to be solved, something logical, something efficient, something that removes emotional complexity. This is rationalization at its most subtle, not denying reality, but reorganizing it in a way that eliminates discomfort. And once that framework is established, the next steps no longer feel like choices, they feel like obligations, like something that must be done rather than something that could be questioned. This is why the turning point is so difficult to recognize from the inside, because it does not feel like crossing a line, it feels like stepping into purpose. It feels like clarity, like finally understanding what one is meant to do. But that is precisely what makes it so dangerous, because when purpose is built on unchallenged belief, it becomes immune to correction, resistant to doubt, and increasingly detached from reality. And in that quiet moment, when everything seems to make sense, when every piece falls into place, something else quietly disappears, the ability to ask, what if I am wrong? And once that question is gone, there is nothing left to slow him down, nothing left to interrupt the path he has already decided to follow, not because it is the only path, but because it is the only one he allows himself to see. At first, the change does not look like a collapse. It looks like refinement, like improvement, like a sharper, more focused version of who he has always been. The thoughts become cleaner, more decisive. The hesitation that once existed begins to fade, replaced by a sense of clarity that feels almost reassuring. But this is how transformation often disguises itself, not as destruction, but as progress. What begins to disappear is not his intelligence, not his discipline, but something far more subtle, the space between thought and action, the moment where doubt used to live. That space shrinks slowly, almost imperceptibly, until decisions no longer feel like choices. They feel automatic, inevitable, as if there is no longer a need to pause, to question, to reflect. This is the beginning of psychological narrowing, where the world becomes smaller, not physically, but cognitively. Alternative perspectives lose their weight, other viewpoints start to feel irrelevant, even irrational, and the only narrative that remains is the one he has constructed for himself. And because that narrative has been built on logic, on consistency, on a framework that appears flawless from the inside, it becomes increasingly difficult to challenge. The most dangerous part of this transformation is that it feels justified at every step. There is no single moment that signals something is wrong, no internal alarm that tells him to stop. Instead, each decision reinforces the last, creating a chain of reasoning that strengthens over time, turning belief into conviction and conviction into identity. And once identity becomes tied to this new way of thinking, stepping back is no longer just difficult, it becomes threatening. Because to question his actions now would mean questioning who he has become, and for someone whose entire sense of self is built on certainty, that is not something he can allow. This is where empathy begins to erode completely, not out of malice, but out of necessity. To maintain his internal consistency, he has to distance himself from anything that could introduce doubt, and emotions, especially empathy, are unpredictable. They complicate decisions. They blur the clean lines he has worked so hard to establish. So they are gradually pushed aside, not violently, but deliberately, replaced with reasoning that feels stronger, more reliable, more aligned with his sense of purpose. And as this process continues, something else begins to shift, the way he perceives himself. He is no longer just someone making decisions. He becomes the center of the system itself, the point around which everything else revolves. His perspective is no longer one of many. It becomes the standard by which all others are measured. This is not a sudden break from reality. It is a slow redefinition of it, where the boundaries between self and world begin to blur, where his thoughts start to feel like truths, and his judgments start to feel like laws. And the tragedy is, from the outside, this might look like power, like control, like someone who has mastered their environment. But from the inside, it is something much more fragile, a system that cannot tolerate disruption, a mindset that depends entirely on its own consistency to survive. Because the moment something challenges it, the moment a crack appears in that perfect structure, everything he has built is at risk of collapsing, not just his actions, but his entire identity. And so he continues forward, not because he is unaware of the cost, but because turning back would require him to confront a possibility he has spent his entire life avoiding. The possibility that he is not as certain, not as superior, not as infallible as he needs to believe. And by the time that realization becomes unavoidable, the person he once was is no longer something he can return to, only something he can barely remember. Over time, the cost of this transformation does not appear as a single dramatic consequence. It unfolds quietly, settling into the fabric of his daily existence, reshaping how he thinks, how he relates, and most importantly, how he experiences himself. Because once a person builds their identity on absolute certainty, they lose something essential, the ability to rest. There is no peace in a mind that must constantly validate itself, no stillness in a system that depends on being right at all times. Every thought becomes part of a larger structure that must remain intact. Every decision must align with the identity he has constructed, and any inconsistency, no matter how small, becomes a threat that needs to be managed, explained, or eliminated. This creates a state of continuous psychological tension, not the kind that is visible or explosive, but the kind that is internalized, controlled, and sustained over long periods of time. It is the pressure of maintaining perfection, not in the eyes of others, but within his own mind, where the standards are even higher and far less forgiving. And as this tension builds, something else begins to erode, the ability to experience genuine connection. Because connection requires vulnerability, it requires the willingness to be seen as incomplete, as uncertain, as human. But for someone who has defined themselves through superiority, vulnerability feels like a form of collapse, something to be avoided at all costs. So relationships become strategic rather than emotional, interactions become calculated rather than spontaneous, and over time, the distance between him and everyone else grows, not because others have changed, but because he no longer allows himself to meet them on equal ground. This leads to a deeper form of isolation, one that is not defined by physical distance, but by psychological separation. He is surrounded by people, yet unable to truly connect, constantly engaged, yet fundamentally alone. And in that isolation, the mind does something it always does when it lacks external grounding. It turns inward, reinforcing its own beliefs, strengthening its own logic, creating a closed loop where every thought confirms the next. This is how rigidity forms, not as stubbornness, but as self-preservation, because once the system becomes self-contained, it no longer needs outside validation, it only needs internal consistency. But the problem with a system like this is that it becomes increasingly fragile over time, because it has no flexibility, no room for error, no capacity to adapt when reality does not align with expectation. And when that happens, when something breaks through the structure he has built, the impact is not small, it is overwhelming, because it does not just challenge a belief, it threatens the entire identity that belief supports. This is the long-term consequence that is often overlooked, not the external outcomes, but the internal cost of living in a reality that must constantly be controlled, constantly defended, constantly justified. Because eventually, the question is no longer whether he is right or wrong. The question becomes how long a person can sustain a version of themselves that leaves no room for doubt, no space for error, no permission to simply exist without needing to prove anything. And in that quiet, unrelenting pressure, something essential continues to fade, not all at once, but slowly, gradually, until what remains is not a sense of purpose, but a system that no longer knows how to stop. There is a quiet loneliness that does not come from being alone, but from feeling like no one could truly understand what is happening inside your mind. And in many ways, that is where his story begins to feel uncomfortably familiar, not in the scale of his actions, but in the emotions that quietly drive them. Because at some point, most people have felt it, the distance between who they are on the outside and what they carry on the inside. The sense that no matter how much you achieve, how well you perform, there is still a part of you that remains unseen, unacknowledged, almost invisible. For him, that distance becomes a defining experience. Surrounded by expectations, recognized for his abilities, yet never truly met as a person beyond them. And when recognition is always tied to performance, it creates a subtle form of abandonment, not the kind where people leave, but the kind where they never really arrive. You are seen, but only partially. You are valued, but only conditionally. And over time, that leaves behind a question that is rarely spoken out loud. If I stop being exceptional, would anyone still care? That question does not disappear. It lingers, shaping decisions, influencing identity, pushing a person further into the version of themselves that feels safest, even if it is not the most authentic. This is how loneliness can exist even in a crowded world, not because there are no people around, but because there is no space to simply exist without proving something. And when that kind of loneliness takes root, it begins to change the way you see others. They are no longer potential connections. They become observers, judges, variables in a system where your value is constantly being measured. And when you feel misunderstood long enough, something shifts. You stop trying to be understood. You start believing that maybe no one else is capable of understanding you at all. That belief can feel empowering at first, like a form of independence, like you no longer need validation from anyone else. But underneath it, there is a quiet resignation, an acceptance that connection is no longer possible, that you exist on a different level, separate, isolated, untouchable. And this is where his experience begins to mirror something deeply human, because many people have had moments where they felt too different, too distant, too far removed from others to be truly known. The difference is not in the feeling itself, but in what is done with it. Some people turn inward and begin to question themselves, to search for connection in new ways. Others build walls, stronger, higher, more refined, until no one can reach them, not even themselves. And in his case, those walls are not built out of fear, but out of certainty, the belief that he does not need others, that he has moved beyond the need for understanding. But the truth is, that need never disappears. It is only buried, hidden beneath layers of logic and control, waiting in the quiet moments where there is no one else to impress, no system to maintain, no role to perform. And maybe that is the part that resonates the most, not the intelligence, not the control, But the silent question that remains underneath it all, the question many people carry without ever saying it out loud. Would I still matter if I stopped trying to be more than everyone else? Because sometimes, the deepest form of loneliness is not being alone. It is believing that who you are is only valuable when you are more than who you truly are. There comes a point where the noise fades, where the calculations slow down, where even the constant need to justify, to control, to prove, begins to quiet, and what remains is not clarity, but something far more unsettling. A silence that does not feel peaceful, but hollow. It is in this silence that the true cost begins to surface, not as regret, not as panic, but as an absence, a space where something essential used to exist, but can no longer be found. Because for all the structure he has built, for all the precision and certainty, there is one thing that cannot be reconstructed once it has been eroded, the ability to feel grounded in something real, something human, something beyond his own mind. The world around him continues to move. People continue to exist, to speak, to connect, but it all begins to feel distant, like watching life through a pane of glass, close enough to observe, but never close enough to touch. And the more he leans into his constructed identity, the more that distance grows, until even the idea of connection feels abstract, like something that belongs to another version of himself that no longer fits. This is not the kind of loneliness that demands attention. It does not cry out. It does not disrupt. It simply settles in, quietly replacing what used to be there. Conversations lose their depth. Interactions lose their weight. And over time, even his own thoughts begin to echo, repeating the same patterns, the same logic, the same conclusions, without anything new to challenge them. And in that repetition, something begins to fade, not his intelligence, not his awareness, but his sense of meaning. Because meaning does not come from control, it comes from connection, from uncertainty, from the unpredictable nature of being human. And without those elements, everything becomes efficient, structured, and empty. It is a strange contradiction to have everything aligned, everything under control, and yet feel nothing that resembles fulfillment. To have answers for every question and still feel like something important is missing. This is the quiet emptiness that follows when identity becomes too rigid, when there is no room left for spontaneity, no space for doubt, no permission to simply exist without purpose. And the mind, in its attempt to protect itself, continues to reinforce the system, continues to repeat the same patterns, because to acknowledge the emptiness would mean admitting that something is wrong, that all the certainty, all the control, has not led to what it promised. But that realization is dangerous, because it threatens the foundation of everything he has built. So instead, the emptiness is ignored, rationalized, pushed further into the background, where it lingers, persistent, unresolved. And in the rare moments where the noise of his thoughts quiets just enough, it surfaces again, not as a clear realization, but as a feeling, a subtle disconnect, a sense that despite everything, he is still searching for something he cannot name. And perhaps that is the deepest form of isolation, not just being separated from others, but being separated from any sense of meaning that is not self-created, not controlled, not defined by logic. Because when everything is filtered through the need to be certain, to be right, to be above, there is no space left for the simple, fragile, imperfect experience of just being human. And without that, even the most complete system begins to feel incomplete in ways that cannot be solved, only felt in the quiet spaces he has spent so long trying to eliminate. In the end, what remains is not the image of someone powerful, not the illusion of control, but a quiet realization that everything he built was never truly about the world. It was about himself, about a need that was never fully understood, never fully acknowledged, only acted upon again and again through layers of logic and certainty. Because when you strip away the system, the rules, the identity that has been so carefully constructed, what is left is not a god, not a symbol, but a person who once stood at the edge of a choice and believed that stepping forward would finally make everything make sense. And for a while it did. It felt like clarity, like purpose, like direction. It answered questions he had carried for years, questions about fairness, about meaning, about whether one person could truly matter. But answers built on certainty come with a hidden cost. They do not leave room for growth, for reflection, for change. They demand consistency, and consistency demands that you keep going, even when something inside you begins to feel off. This is the part that often goes unnoticed, the quiet persistence of a path that no longer feels right, but cannot be abandoned because too much has already been built upon it. Too many decisions, too much identity, too much belief. And so the only option that remains is forward, not because it is the best choice, but because it is the only one that does not require everything to fall apart. But what if the cost of holding everything together is losing the ability to recognize who you were before it all began? What if the version of yourself you are protecting is no longer the one that needed protection in the first place? There is something deeply human in that struggle, the fear of being wrong, not just about a decision, but about who you are. Because admitting that would mean facing something far more uncomfortable than failure. It would mean facing the possibility that you built your entire identity on a belief that was never as solid as it felt. And maybe that is where his story lingers, not in what he achieved, not in what he controlled, but in what he could never allow himself to question. The idea that being right was more important than being human. Because in the end, control can create structure, it can create order, it can even create the illusion of meaning, but it cannot replace the quiet, imperfect, uncertain experience of simply existing as a person among other people. And when that experience is lost, when everything becomes filtered through the need to justify, to prove, to maintain, something essential slips away, something that cannot be rebuilt through logic or reclaimed through control. So maybe the question is not whether someone like him could lose everything, but whether the moment he chose certainty over doubt, he had already begun to lose the one thing that mattered most. And if you were given the same sense of clarity, the same belief that you were absolutely right, would you have the strength to question it, or would you follow it all the way to the end?